Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries. I'm your host, Lucas Curcio, and joining us for the third time is Dr. Samuel Frost, and we're going to talk about preterism in relation to anti-Semitism, maybe even talk about Christian nationalism and how and if that's connected. But Dr. Frost, thanks for coming on again. Is it third time? As I said, I think you're one of my few guests who's made it to the third time here. So welcome.
Oh, well, that's a pleasure. Hopefully, it
Yeah,
won't be the
absolutely.
last.
What's that?
Hopefully, it won't be the last.
Oh no, definitely not. Yeah, so and I could see us having more talks and everything. But I was excited to talk with this about you because for a while I thought, as I just mentioned, pre-show, I thought I was going a little bit crazy and I was seeing stuff that other people maybe weren't seeing, and I was questioning, what's going on, questioning people's motives, hearing things, a lot of rhetoric, and there seems to be a strong I'm gonna use the word anti-Semitism, but I really just want to be clear. There's a strong dislike, a strong contempt, a strong hatred towards Jews in one particular eschatological camp, namely Preterism. It's also connected to Christian nationalism, I believe now too, because a lot of them are preterists. But I want to talk to you about it because, as maybe our audience know, you've come out of the hyper-preterist world, and so you're very familiar with that world. And when I messaged you privately to ask, what your thoughts are, and you seem to be in agreement with me. So, just want to, kind of take the conversation from there and just hear your thoughts so far.
Yeah, it's basically there's no anti-Semitism is a hard. There's a few definitions, floating around. From a biblical standpoint, it would be kind of the idea that Jews post 70 A.D. No longer have any biblical significance. Let me say it that way. In terms of prophecy or anything of that nature. So there's no relationship in preterism, and also in full preterism. There's no real relationship with anything to do with Jews today or historically after 70 AD or after 133, 136, if you want to throw in the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that, so biblically, prophetically speaking, there's no more significance with Jews or Judaism or any of that kind of aspect, or that they're still here, or whether or not they're still here. For example, in preterist writings, there's Phil Kaiser. This is a quote somebody posted on my Facebook post, because I put up the book by Shlomo Sand, The Invention of the Jewish People.
Yeah, I saw that.
Very good book. In so many regards, he of course accepts the higher critical idea of the biblical narratives as, mytho, historical, pieced together, redacted over, probably written post-exile, Babylonian exile, so the 6th century, 5th century, that's where the biblical texts, Moses and the story of Exodus, all this really begins to get written down and emerge. And those are several texts that have been put together and redacted and put, to what we currently have today in our Bible. That's pretty staple criticism you find today in any university. That's pretty much with typical, I'd say, Society of Biblical Literature scholars. That's a fairly typical hodgepodge of ideas that go on there. But on that post, someone quotes Phil Kaiser here. It says, just a quote, assertions that the history of Israel ended in AD 70 are false. It's quite clear from history that Israel did not end as a nation until it was wiped off the face of the map in the Bar Kokhba revolt, the final war that completely removed Israel from Palestine, AD 133, 136. Likewise, it can be shown that Revelation moves in a linear fashion from 66 to 136 AD. That'd be a preterist. There's your preterism.
Hmm.
When Israel was completely wiped out and removed from the land. That's an unquote. So that's from Phil Kaiser. Um,
And he's a
from his,
preterist.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah,
Gotcha.
you
Okay.
saw it there. The Revelation moves. Now it's been extended to 136 because you can't forget, can't forget about the Bar Kokhba revolt because here you had, a few 100,000 Jews still living in Judea. Where do these people come from? So they could not have been deported in 70 A.D. because they're all still around and in the areas. And uh, the idea that they're completely wiped out, totally removed, totally completely. This is what Shlomo Sand in his book, which I have actually, I've got that right here,
Hmm.
Invention of the Jewish People, where he shows that that's just not correct. A good portion of Judeans stayed. Number one, Rome did not have this deportation program. You consider the expenditures of having to remove and then find out every single Jew. Let's get every single one of them, um, and 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 then remove them. They didn't have that kind of thing. There were captives that were taken, and some of the young were taken, as well. Some of the women would have been taken and sold, enslaved and sold into various slave markets or uh, however they did that. Um, but they didn't take the entire population of Judea and that whole area there, or even in Upper Galilee. You had Jews all over. See, that's the thing. Jews were everywhere. They were all throughout Rome. We know that they were in Rome. This goes back to 6th century. We know that pockets of Jews, not all of them went back during the exile under Cyrus and the return to the land.
Hmm.
Great populations stayed out and did not return. They might have a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but then they would go back to their thing. We see this in the book of Acts, chapter 2, in the opening.
So you're
Jews from all
responding
over.
to like you're responding to the preterists, and not even preterists, but it's just like, even if they're not a preterist nowadays, there's so much talk about how
Mm-hmm.
Israel is not legitimate. And when they mean by Israel, like there are no Jews, to your point. And
Yeah,
then if they want to ground that in theology, if they're Christian or non-Christian, they both seem to fall back on this 80-70 dispersion. And then somehow through this, their DNA was just lost. And you can actually, like, and I have people quote to me too, you can't prove that Jews by blood today have a direct heritage,
yeah.
ancestry to Abraham.
That
Would
might
you?
be that's something to consider. I mean, that's uh, um, when you talk about a pure Jewish blood. When you talk about that kind of thing and what we have in genetics and DNA and all of this stuff, and but to San's point, there never really was this kind. There's Middle Eastern, Arabic, Semitic strands, if you want to say, Middle Eastern DNA, um, which is located, which is found in Africa and India, and it's kind of all over. You find it everywhere. There's this integration that goes on, and there's certainly attestable counts. For example, the conquering of the Edomians um, by the Hasmoneans, and the Hasmoneans come out of this. And Herod is considered a Jew, even though he's not, but
Hmm.
he's Idumean. But they were assimilated. So we find throughout Israel's history there's a lot of assimilation with other nations that are going on, particularly Alexandria, Babylonia, Parthia, Persia, even Rome. So the identity of what Israel is this unique DNA kind of unbroken chain or unbroken bloodline. I don't think many Jewish scholars today would accept that. However, knowing that, there was still this ethnicity that was identified with being what a Jew is or what a Jew was. And they
So
certainly
that's
weren't
an
wiped off
interesting.
the face of the earth in
Yeah.
136. They were not wiped off the face of the earth, nor did they cease to exist. That's just
So
actually,
that's an
they
interesting
kind of
point.
grew in numbers, actually.
Yeah, because what you're saying is, well, I'll grant you that maybe some of these Jews who are alive today, they don't have a pure blood, and that kind of
Right,
happens in all ethnicities. Like you can be
right,
70%
right, right.
Italian, 50% Italian. Well, you still have that in you, and it's like,
Yeah.
I'm half Italian, so I go back to my father's side, and just because I'm not full blooded Italian doesn't mean I'm not a Curcio and don't have a direct ancestry. I think because my father was born in Italy, I can even appeal to for a citizenship. I believe, but yeah, but, that is a great point because this is
Yeah,
a
there's
really
like
prevalent
what, five
argument.
genetic lines. What's the Caucasian, Middle Eastern, African, um, Asian, and yeah, 4 or 5 different types of strains that we have. And when you start going back, looking your ancestry, that's the problems with ancestry. These
Yeah,
genetic tests you can take and you find out your thing. There's so many migrated, so many things going on there. But yes, still there is an ethnicity that's um that
to this
yeah you
day,
can
Jewish, right? Like
right, right.
actual offspring of Abraham.
You can identify right, right, right. There's a Semitic strand, but again, the science is yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
This is a new field of genetic.
gotcha. Yeah.
It's all brand
Well,
new,
what
brand new.
just to go back to what would you describe again, a really easy, concise manner for our audience? What would you describe is true anti-Semitism? Because just before you answer that, I don't want to concede that term because people are usually saying that anti-Semitism is kind of this boogeyman where anybody disagrees with
Yeah, yeah,
Israel, they're labeled as that, and I'm not using it that way. And I don't want to use it that way, but at the same time, I don't want to concede this term just because there's an abuse of it. Kind of like when people today throw around the word heresy. Like if you
yeah.
disagree with them on anything, it's heresy. But
Right.
so that's true, but it doesn't mean there is an actual heresy out there. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about anti-Semitism, I'm referring to true Jewish hatred, contempt because somebody falls within this bracket or is a ethnic Jew. Like, would you agree with me on that?
Yeah. Let me give you the. This is the definite. Okay, so define. This is the U.S. State Department. This is their. This is the
Okay.
official uh,
Yeah.
definition. So it's anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And we don't want to accuse anybody, you know, but certain expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical or physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish individuals and or their property or the Jewish community, institutions, or religious uh, facilities. It goes a little further. Manifestations might include targeting, the state of Israel, not criticizing it, targeting the state of Israel, conceived as Jewish collectivity. Um, and it makes a distinction between criticism.
Yeah, that's
Anti-Semitism
important.
frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, like there's a Jewish conspiracy kind of thing. It's often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong, or is it expressed in speech, writing, visual forms, and actions, employs sinister stereotypes, negative character traits, um, that kind of that these kinds of things, and it gives a bunch of lists of things. For example, denying the Jewish people their right of self-determination.
Mhm.
Um, Now, some of this gets tricky because here it starts going into claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is racist and or anti-Semitic. So, because now we have the state of Israel, and that certainly figures in Christian history, that's going to figure into prophecy. It's it's one of those things. Big portion of our Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, talks about Israel, and Paul does too.
Yeah.
So Israel has to figure into our conversation as Christians. But for the preterists, I think reflecting Phil Kaiser preterism, and then obviously um, the full preterists, is that Israel is, and that's why I say, I'm not saying full preterist, and you're not saying this, hate Jews and discriminate against, if you're Jews, we're not going to hire you. They would be for that kind of stuff and this, that, and the other. But it kind of tends towards there's no such thing as Judaism today, or biblical Judaism, or biblical. There's no biblical Jews today. that's that kind of. I think that's anti-Semitic when you say that. I do think that there are biblical Jew. I think that was not wiped off the face of the planet in one or 70 AD and 136. So to me, that kind of rhetoric certainly would lend a hand to those who definitely were, full blown anti-Semitic.
Yeah, because I
So
find this
yeah,
not just in the hyper preterist, but even the partial preterist, and
yeah,
a lot of people in our country today, like I said, even if they're not Christians, a lot of them are using the same type of rhetoric, and it's prominent in the church, and if it's prominent in the church, it's prominent in the Reformed Church, I should say. It seems to be more so than anything because a lot of them are partial preterists, and
right,
it seems to be then like, would you agree? Then it seems to be it's their eschatology that's a driving factor for this because for them, God has officially divorced Israel, to use the language of Ken Gentry, and
yeah.
he dispersed them, judged them in 70 AD, and that was his final, you know,
That was it. He's
basically
done.
final goodbye. Yeah, no more. All promises have been superseded, and it all goes to the church, and that's it. And so when they view the state of Israel today, they say, "Oh, that's not biblical Jews. That's not First Testament. They're illegitimate." And I do
Yeah,
agree with you what you said. Like
that to
that
me
is
is kind
anti.
of demeaning. That's demeaning when you say that kind of stuff.
Well, it is because it's like if somebody comes along and tells me, Lucas, you're not an Italian, Lucas, you're not an American, it's
Yeah.
how would anybody feel about that? It's denying that. And I've even seen too, like I said, I'm really seeing nowadays some people on Twitter here and there say that Jesus was not a Jew because they want to, this leads into other things where you have such a disdain again for for Jewishness, and you think that's not legitimate. They kind of just want to go full force a little bit and
Yeah.
say that Jesus wasn't a Jew, and people are saying this now on Twitter. So like it doesn't. I'm worried it doesn't stop here because
What
I've
was
seen history. What's that?
he? Then what was he?
Yeah, but what? Yeah,
The blood. He had human human blood and human DNA that would have come mitochondrial from his mother. So he would have. She was Jewish. So
what are your views? Because I know you came out of hyperpreterism and you've been in that view. So what is your and you're non-millennialist, just for the viewers. So he's not a
yeah,
dispensationalist. He's not going to be, your John Nelson Darby preacher. He kind of
no.
has an eclectic approach to eschatology. But what are your views on Israel in the Bible and really, in
Well,
relation to eschatology?
I think there's two books I just finished by Walter Kaiser, Mission to the Nation or Light to the Nations, Israel's mission. So it's on the idea of missions being a light to the world, and it's interesting that Shlomo Sand, who I would say is liberal, but nonetheless he's a scholar of Tel Aviv. He's quite he's really in minutia going through the details. And I want to distinguish between Jews being who they are. There's no monolithic view that's out there. Not all Jews are Zionists. Zionism is a whole other thing that's
Oh
going on.
yeah, we should talk about that
Yeah,
quick.
so
Yeah.
and not all Jews support Zionism. They don't. So that's a whole other discussion. And when we find Judaism in the first century, there's Judaisms. There's another one, probably one of the top scholars in the field on Judaism is Jacob Neusner, and this book here, which Major Trends in Formative Judaism, 3 stages in the formation of Judaism. And Neusner is one of the top, guys in the field as far as these types of studies, and we'll get into him a little bit. But um, you know what Sand is doing, much like I do, is for example, Abraham's household. They're not Jews. Um, he has all of these male servants. They're coming out of Chaldea, I guess. That would be
Mm.
his household, and he has them all circumcised. And then from that point on, they become they become Jewish. There's, in other words, with Kaiser, Walter Kaiser, and Sand, they understand what is called um, covenantal kinsmanship. In other words, you can be adopted in through covenant. So anyone could be adopted in to covenant. And there's an interesting story, and Sand brings this up too. There's an interesting story about the Shechem. You remember, and one of the sons of Shechem rapes Dinah, the daughter of
Yes.
Jacob, and then they go out and they said, "Hey," and the language there is very interesting. When they meet these Shechemites, and I wanted to find the story because this shows the kind of idea, and Kaiser brings this up as well too, and I think it's what's in Genesis 34. And so they go out and they say, uh, intermarry with us and give us your daughters so that we can take your daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us, and the land is open to you to live and trade and acquire property. And he says, and then Shechem agrees to that, and it states that we will give you our consent to you on one condition only, that you will become like us by circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters to take your daughters for ourselves. Will settle among you and become one people with you. See, that language you find in little places throughout. And then in the Exodus, many Egyptian servants come out with them too. So it's not this pure kind of thing that's going on. And then of course Moses is married to she's not Jewish, Joseph's wife, who Manasseh and Ephraim have two sons by Joseph. They're not Jewish. She's married. She's an Egyptian. You find these little things. Ruth's a Moabite. She's not Jewish at all, but yet she's assimilated and brought in. And then finally, in Esther, we find a unique little passage. A lot of people don't use this particular passage, but it's brought out, and it's interesting that Sand, you have to pronounce his name right, Shlomo Sand, he brings it out too, and it's at the end of chapter 8. So for the verse 16, for the chapter 8:16 of Esther, the book of Esther. Oh, yeah, one other thing about Esther. Well into the time of the Persian kingdoms, right? And no one ever asks this question: why is Esther why isn't she back in the land? What are all these Jews doing in Persia? That's the one thing, and I actually picked that up through reading a Jewish commentary, that the real grievance about Esther is that why are all these Jews in Persia? Why? This is well after the return to the land, and yet you still find all these Jews that are hanging out here in Persia. Which, yes, right. Most of them didn't return. Only a small amount returned. Nehemiah says a remnant. Only a remnant returned.
Just to recap, are you saying that basically because like in the Old Testament, how you can have working definitions where other people can be incorporated into Israel in relation to eschatology? Are you saying like in the end times something like this is going to happen again? You mean to say?
So this passage, in every province, in every city, wherever the edict of the king went forth, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, and feasting and celebrating, and many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized upon them. So that's an interesting passage in reading the history, and it's interesting that Shlomo Sand brings that up. Not a lot of people read that passage, but there it clearly says that many other nations became Jews. Well, how do you become a Jew? Well, like how did Abraham's male servants become it? So you have this assimilation that is geared around the idea of covenant kinism, Kinism. So this idea that you become adopted or you can become assimilated in through covenant. You obey the rules and obey the laws of Moses, of course. But once you do all of that, yes, then you are regarded. And there's many Psalms. There's all kinds of things. For example, in Isaiah, there's many places where it talks about then the nations will come, and so there's this large assimilation in which they will become, you know, Jews are a part of Israel's. The Gentiles would become a part of Israel's thing. So, and if that's the case, then you have to have two things at work at once until the end, and that is you have to have an identity of this idea of Jew or Jewish entity, but then you have to have this assimilation into what is the
Okay,
promise,
I
the
see what you're
covenant.
saying. Yeah,
It's
because
kind of
I'm
yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
You know what? That's a really interesting point because I'm thinking of Romans 11 where Paul talks about how
Oh yeah,
we were grafted. Speaking of
absolutely.
Gentiles, a wild olive tree, we were grafted in. And
Yeah.
so what you're saying is, just for the audience, I think that's actually a fascinating point. You're saying this idea of Jewishness has to continue until the end because this is what the church is assimilating into. That's that's
That's
really
right.
a phenomenal point, Dr.
And it's
Frost.
interesting that a critical, liberal, he doesn't believe in Moses he doesn't, any of that whatsoever. Even though he's, Shlomo San. So he
Well,
definitely
because
he's the Tel Aviv University. I mean, the guy's so, and he's careful not to knock any of this stuff. He's like, but when you read the actual thing, um, this is the way it is. And I thought, well, that's Paul. That's what Paul's doing in Romans 9 through 11. That's exactly what he's doing. And so he's trying to show. So, but you had this other variant strain where it did believe in strict Jewish blood and ethnicity can't be broken. And you get out of that a nationality or nationalism with this just strict identification. And the closest parallel on many levels that we can find is Muslims regarding their religion of Islam.
hmm,
Yeah, you can be a convert. Yeah, but you're not Arabic. There's always
hmm.
kind of but you're not Arabic. You know.
Well, that's
Yeah,
what's
you get your
happening.
English translation of the Quran. Yeah, that's you can't read Arabic though.
Well,
Arabic is Arabic. You got to
yeah.
read Arabic. It's that kind of discrimination that some in Paul's day, and certainly today, were discriminatory towards Gentiles like that. And Paul's coming back and saying, yeah, that's not really been, we shouldn't be this way at all. We should allow in. In fact, the prophets say that they're going to come in. We should assimilate them into our promises, our covenants, our forefathers, our way of life, all of these types of things, which I think is what he's doing in 11. But there's no
Okay, so
replacement. One nation's being replaced by another. That's not going on.
so would you say then? I just did an episode on Romans 11, by the way. If the audience wants to go back, I did it with Matthew Irvine, but we went through it verse by verse. So would you say though Romans 11, just to give a quick overview, it says all Israel will be saved one day. Would you say that definitely because of this Jewishness that has to continue in order for the church to assimilate into this, that will encompass a national salvation of Israel of actual bloodline Jews coming to
Well,
Christ?
yeah, here's um, another facet. I don't think Paul is envisioning a 1948,
Restoration kind of thing, right?
I don't a geopolitical nation state kind of thing. But I think what he's doing there is the validity or fulfillment of the promise. This is where preterism gets into trouble. The validity fulfillment of the promises. So he makes it quite explicit in 9, where he's very plain. For the sake of my own flesh, the people of Israel. So he's clearly making a demarcation there of a particular, these people, Israel, Jews,
Mm.
these people here, who Paul is associated with, these people. And then he, goes on in some places, I'm a Benjamite, I'm a Hebrew, I'm an Israelite, I'm circumcised on the 8th day, and all of that. all of those identification markers. But then he says theirs. So you'd have to ask, who's theirs? Well, Israel. It's theirs.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Theirs is the adoption of sons. Theirs the divine glory. Theirs are the covenants. Theirs the receiving of the law. Theirs is the worship, and theirs is the promises, which Paul's whole letter about in Romans is about the fulfillment of the promises. Well, if the fulfillment of the promises, for example, one of them is the adoption. Well, what is the adoption? Well, just back up a little bit. He tells you what it is. He says here, who wait for the adoption, the redemption of the body. That's resurrection talk.
Hmm.
So these things continue all the way up until the resurrection of the dead, which, if that's the case, theirs is the adoption, which is the redemption of the body. Then he can go through Romans 11. If their transgression means riches for the world and their loss means riches for the nation, how much greater riches will their fullness be? That's a future looking. And then he states again, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? That's resurrection. He's right back there. So if the promises and covenants and adoption and all the rest of it made to Israel that we find in the history of Israel, if those have been fulfilled and done, and that's the end of that, well, then we're done here.
Well, and you know what? I'm happy you brought this up because there are hyper. I'm sorry, they're hyper. There are partial preterists today who are saying Romans 11 was fulfilled in AD 70. Did you ever hear about that?
Yes, I've heard James Jordan say this.
Okay, yeah, because I heard people
they try to,
like Joel Webben say this. I don't know if you know Joel Webben
Gary
is.
Gary DeMar and Robert Cruikshank, all these guys.
Yeah, so they're arguing that
all Israel was saved in AD 70 through some sort of a removal from Sheol.
So is that just a hyper spiritual? Because you have resurrection language being used in Romans 11, life from the dead.
They have to.
So is this a hyper spiritualizing it, right?
Or they'll take what will their reconciliation be, but life from the dead. They'll take that as a spiritual resurrection. So they get off into all this spiritual Gnostic kind of stuff. When for Paul in his world. And then you read people like Shlomo Sand. See, he gets it, and he's not even a believer, but he's reading the text. He's like, well, that's what it says. So Paul's operating on this idea of this fullness of Israel, this resurrection when Israel. Now, interestingly enough, you find Sand also mentioning there's a whole other group of Jews, both past and present, who rejected the idea because they saw themselves as in exile. They're scattered among the nations, and they are to follow the advice of the prophet Jeremiah: build cities, have families, be good citizens, practice Torah, synagogue. But what are we waiting for? We're waiting for life in the age to come. That is the next great. That's when God will regather us together. He will bring us into a new heavens and a new earth in the age to come, and we'll be raised immortal. But until then, we should not be at war with any nation. We should, if we're Germans, we're German citizens. If we're living in Italy, we're Italian citizens. We'll be Italian Jews, but we'll be good Italian Jews. That kind of stuff. And that's very rich because they saw themselves as in exile. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's what Paul's doing. He's quoting the language of Israel being scattered or in exile. And that whole type of. Now, you can see where some Jews then would oppose what's going on in Israel today, because this is a secular restoration. This is not a restoration under a Davidic king or a Messiah king. This is a totally, completely secular realization. And so many of Jews are opposed to it. These are Orthodox Jews that are opposed to this kind of stuff that we see going on in Israel today. And then the Christians get torn here because we hate seeing the slaughter of, Palestinians in Gaza. I can't endorse endorse that kind of. I don't like war. I don't. I don't like when human beings, blow each other up and that kind of stuff. But you don't want to get into the. See,
But
Muslims have the same thing. This pure bloodline, pure ethnicity, pure nationality, and it's us and them. And I think what Paul does is he's kind of saying, no, Israel has always been absorbed. We can absorb Gentiles into, and then they become Jews. They're referred to as Jews, or they're Jewish.
but why do you
Anyway,
why do you think though in the
this
preterist
is a big
camp?
subject.
What's that?
This is a big subject. I
It
mean,
yeah, definitely.
volumes have been written on this stuff, so it's
Yeah.
trying to
Um,
shrink it all in.
why do you okay, so we could kind of understand why the preterists, because they view it's all been fulfilled, God put away. There's automatically a sneering upon Israel when you mention it. But why do you think it has resulted? And have you experienced this where nowadays they're also and you know what? By the way, I just want to mention. So you mentioned how Islam has this ethno nationalism, which
Yeah,
many Christian nationalists now have gone into. This ethno nationalism has gone from Christian
that's very
nationalism
weird.
to ethno nationalism. But why this is happening? A lot of them are preterists. So they have this disdain for Israel, contempt, to deny that
Yeah, let
they're
me say that I am not a Christian nationalist.
same. Yeah, I'm not a Christian nationalist either.
Don't endorse that nonsense at all.
Yeah, and I'm happy to hear that. But, so why do you think though now this is spilled into it's gone beyond just saying, well, preterism. It's their preterism and ethno-nationalism has seemed to have adapted to the Jews are to blame for everything. And as you use the keyword Zionism, right? Anything
Yeah, yeah.
that they don't like is now Zionism. And if you support Israel, even if you don't, even if you're not saying I support the political state, you're a Zionist. Like, what do you think is causing that?
Well, because they have no more prophetic significance anymore. I mean, there's nothing really unique or you know at all. I mean, it's entirely the church. Now, if somebody who's Jewish uh, wants to join the church, fantastic. But I think Paul saw it the other way around. It's rather the nations are joining Israel. That's what the prophets say. You
Hmm.
you you come you
Yeah.
become. In fact, it's when you read the literature and then you see guys like this even getting it. You're like, wow, this guy even gets it. Um, because what we're uh, there's a passage in the Psalms I was wanting to find. It's this idea of assimilation, but what are we being assimilated into? Well, what the promises, the covenants, the forefathers, that whole story, that whole thing. Um, that's what we as Gentiles are assimilated into. If those promises and everything have been fulfilled, like they tried to do Romans 11, they try to put that in 70 AD. Well, then what am I being assimilated into now? It's Paul has a continuity of Abraham, Moses, David, and those in under his ministry, Gentiles or Hagoyim, of coming in and assimilating. He doesn't, as a Jewish rabbi who believes in Yeshua Hamashiach, he comes to believe he has no issues scripturally, and that would be the Hebrew scriptures, with Gentiles being assimilated in, even outnumbering uh, Jewish believers in the Messiah. That's not an issue for Paul. We've made that an issue, but that's not an issue for Paul. He would still see that entire entity as Israel. That's
Now, what would you
Israel.
say though? Because I'm hearing them in my mind though, and I think it's ironic, but they would push back at you and say, a lot of them would say, well, that's dispensationalism.
Well, of what is?
So you speak in the language, biblical language, that we're being assimilated into Israel, not vice versa, which is Romans 11
Yeah,
language.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Israel must must continue, and this idea of Jewishness has to continue as well. They're going to push back and say that's dispensationalism, or they'll also even push back and say, somebody has told me that I'm simping for the Jews when I say this. I don't know if you heard, language like that, but like you're giving more credence to Israel than the church, and we're putting the Israel before the church. And again, like
I don't know
Zionism,
who are
that's
doing
Zionist.
that because, again, Paul's definition of what constitutes Israel is by faith. Um, that's his whole thing. That's the way it's always been. That's so Paul's arguing this in Romans. The way that it's always been is circumcision of the heart. And everyone thinks circumcision of the heart is something Paul comes up with. No, go back and read Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy 30, Jeremiah 9, Jeremiah 4. They all talk about circumcision of the heart. Jeremiah is very condemning of those that are circumcised only in the flesh, but you're not circumcised in the heart. And he's condemning, and he's speaking to Israel. So this Holy Spirit, Nicodemus, you're Jewish. You're a doctor of the law. You read the Tanakh. Don't you know you must be born from above? This is what the Tanakh teaches. That's where Paul's getting it. He's pulling that out of. And so just because you were circumcised on the 8th day and you were born to the tribe of whatever, Benjamin or tribe of Judah, that doesn't automatically count you in the family of God. That's Paul's whole point. Any more than it did Esau, who was circumcised on the 8th day, certainly a son of Abraham, or Ishmael, who was also circumcised and certainly a son of Abraham. We can go down the list of a bunch of people like that, but you can't say they were saved or that they were filled with the Kodesh Ruach, the Holy Spirit. They weren't. They didn't have that. How could you say that about an idolatrous people who has caused blasphemy among the nations because of their actions? And that's Romans 2, and he's quoting Isaiah. There were, all day long my name is blasphemed among the nations on your account. So these people weren't, they were Israelites, they were Jews, but they certainly weren't filled with the Holy Spirit. They didn't have circumcision of the heart and all of these types of things. So Paul states that that's the true Israel. That's what's going on there. If that's what's going on there, and that's truly what defines what Israel is or what being a true Jew, he says this in Romans 2. And I don't think he's making a spiritual case for spiritual Jew there, but he is making a case for what a true, if you're Jewish like Paul, and now he's circumcised in the heart by the Holy Spirit, that's a true Jew. That's somebody who's truly Jewish. And so what happens then in Romans 2 when he says, what about these Gentiles who demonstrate the Torah written in the heart? Well, that language is Jeremiah 31. He's using New Covenant language there. So what happens if these Gentiles are circumcised in the heart, bearing the fruit of the Holy Spirit? What do you write them off? The law is written in their heart. They're in other words, they're circumcised in the heart. This is his whole thing in Romans 2. And then he goes in Romans 3 and he states, what is God, the God of the nations only? Is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the nations? Surely he's the God of the nations. Well, then how else is God to judge the nations? How else is he to judge the world? If he's excluded them, if there's no chance for them to come into Jews' promises and to the salvation that's been promised to Israel, if there's no chance for them to come into that, then you see that nationality he's fighting against.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Which Paul himself was. He was a nationalist. Was until he met Jesus of Nazareth, and then that changed everything.
Yeah. So.
Oh man.
So. Yeah, you're saying that Romans 2 is not saying all Christians are spiritual Jews, but he's talking about physical Jews who are true believers in God. Is that the true Jew?
Yeah, it's I got numerous commentaries, articles running through my head. So what Paul does in Romans is that he makes these in his rhetoric in his style. He'll make these little blurbs out, and then later on he'll unpack them. So you got to keep reading Romans To understand Romans 1 through 8, you have to understand Romans 1 through 8. You can't just pick out of this because it's a long, sustained kind of an argument. So you can't just pick and choose through Romans. His overall argument begins in chapter 1 with the denunciation of the world, both Jews and Gentiles. He's denouncing the entire enterprise. All alike are under sin. And he states this in Romans 3. So all alike are under sin. The whole world is under sin. By this time in Israel's history, it's easy to prove through Israel's prophets that this institution has failed. The nationality of it has completely failed. And, the nationality and the outer structures of it is getting ready to fall apart even more so. So, but yet, God has promised to redeem Israel and bless all nations, all families in the earth.
Yeah.
Well, if Israel's gone, how is he going to do this? Well, Israel's not gone. But let me tell you what Israel is. And that's where he goes right into Israel by faith. It's this action by faith. So I think in Romans 2, he's laying out this idea of circumcision of the heart. That's a true Jew. And there I think he's speaking in Romans 2:17, now you who call yourself a Jew. And then he ends that very passage with, he said, no, a man is a Jew. So he's talking to a Jew, an actual Jew. A man is a Jew if he is one inwardly. And circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. So how do I think about this? Over the years, the best thing I can think of is here you have Paul, who is as Jewish as you can get. He's a Pharisee. He's worked his way up to the top. He loves his people. He loves Jerusalem. He's taking after his father, who was also a Pharisee. He's absorbed with all things Israel, for Israel, by Israel. And he loves his people, and he loves the scriptures, studies them day and night, meditates them on them all the time. This is what a Pharisee. So you get to this highest echelon that you can in this circle of conservative Judaism, right? And he's morally, he's not an adulterer. He's not stealing. He's not blaspheming God. He's not doing any of these things. He's practicing the Torah. He's doing everything that, within the law. So, and yet he's the best specimen of a Jew that you could find in the first century. This would be him, along with many thousands of others, tens of thousands of others like him. And yet he's persecuting the church, and he nods in approval the death of Stephen.
So
how do you square those two things?
Yeah, exactly. So, does all this mean that preterism can't be true if this is all true? Like, would you agree with me on that?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, preterism is not even on the map here.
Because usually nobody really argues this way. If the
scholars are, the good liberal and conservative scholars are arguing. They're like, this is what's going on with him.
Well, what it is? It's interesting because so much of eschatology, a lot of eschatology has to do with Israel, and preterism does give a decent amount of time to Israel. They just place it in the past, but really, if they're wrong about the future of Israel, which they are, then preterism as a system is wrong. It completely falls apart. And even go back to that original argument that when they want to say the Jews today aren't blood, true blood heritage of Abraham, it's really a battle of exegesis, because what's driving their factors is a theological principle. And so if they're wrong on the interpretation of Romans 11, which is future, then it means Israel, as you said, it must continue until the end time for this to be fulfilled, which means that necessitates actual Jews. So
what people like Shlomo Sand inadvertently do, even though he's critical and doesn't believe in any of this stuff, what he inadvertently does is, and I find this often among some of the liberal scholars I'm reading, I'm like, but he thinks it's like a criticism against what Paul's doing, and I'm like, that's actually what Paul's doing. So he shows this assimilation started from post-exile 6th century, so Cyrus onwards. and then you get to the Hasmoneans and Idumeans, and there's clearly a Hellenistic admixture going on there, because you have these Jews all over the world. They're all, how did they get there? You know, where did these Jews come? And but they're so he's saying, in terms of a strict DNA bloodline, like some unpure, broken, that's never been the case. Rather, it's through covenant adoption and rallying around the idea of being Jewish and law and Torah, this kind of covenant nomism kind of thing going on. He said that's what makes a person Jewish, and the ethnicity Jewish is those types of things. And then he goes and argues, if that's the case, and since all of the biblical promises are false because Abraham never existed, he's putting those two things together, and then he's protesting against Zionist atrocities. 1948 Israel. You see where he's going with that, and I'm like, okay, but what happens if, yes, what you're saying about assimilation is correct, and Abraham did exist, and those promises were made to him? What happens then? And that's what I'm doing. I'm like, well, what happens then? Abraham was real. In fact, he's still alive today in the presence of God as we speak, waiting to be raised from the dead, which was the promise that was made to him, because all nations will be blessed in the new heavens and the new earth. See, all nations from every tribe, 144,000 from the tribe of Israel, plus together with all the peoples, tongues, languages that God, that sounds like one world, one faith, one Lord, one body, one God, one King, no more death, no more sin, no more evil, which is blessed, eternally blessed forever, in a new heavens and in the land and creation that God promised. And I thought, so if that's the case, then this entity of Israel must exist until the end, because what about all these dead Israelites? When are they going to be raised again from the dead? If that's the promise that God gave to them, and we're being assimilated into that, then their promise to be raised from the dead, and we're joined in with that, then we're going to be raised from the dead into glory and inherit the promises as well. In fact, Paul states this when you read it in those lines, first century Judaism. Paul states in Romans 4, it was not through the law that Abraham and his seed received the promise that he would be heir of the world. I'm like, in the age to come. That's what he's saying. And if that's a promise, then whose are the promises? Theirs are the promises. Well, have we inherited the world yet? No. Well, then those promises still stand. Well, if those promises still stand, then so does Israel. God has not rejected his people. It's like,
amen.
God's not rejected his people. That doesn't mean they're all saved any more than in Paul's day or in Jeremiah's day. But it never meant that. It's those who have the Spirit of God circumcised in the heart and expressing from the heart through faith that righteousness is given credit for by God. That's Israel. And I'm like, okay. I can have.
Do you think there is?
Too.
Yeah. Do you think there's like this is connected to somewhat of a anti-Semitism to a spiritual deception, because if this is true, which it is, this is all in God's prophetic plan. For I can easily see why Satan would not want us to believe certain things and have a certain attitude towards them, because this is going to be again the prophetic unfolding of God's ultimate plan in history to redeem the world through Abraham as he promised. Then what again, as looking at it from a spiritual point of view, which is what we should do, I can understand why Satan would want to deceive people, and even sadly even some Christians on this, to have a hatred towards Israel and denying them as legitimate, and twisting and interpreting Bible prophecy to as not being applicable to our time, and almost being really in a real sense being null and void.
Yeah, it's I asked then, did God reject his people? By no means. He's making now. Paul knows that the Romans are going to surround Jerusalem. By this time, he's heard Luke, or perhaps even read. Well, we know he's read some of the Gospels. He quotes a couple of places here and there. On the night that he was betrayed, he gave it. So he's familiar here. Luke. Luke's collecting the resources of Jesus's Gospels and
Yeah, he
stories.
heard the Olivet Discourse.
Well, he would have heard the Olivet Discourse. He would have knew that. Okay, all right, Jerusalem's going to be sacked, and they're going to be okay. So they're going to be scattered among the nations. Okay, well that's according to prophecy. Okay, all right. And so it's in that light he's saying that God reject his people. Did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. What about when they're scattered among the nations? Do they cease being Jewish, or do the promises made to them cease? Oh, I hope not. I hope not. Well, they've been scattered before. Here, I think, and I haven't published a lot of this yet, but
Yeah.
it's a lot of this is in my own just personal studies. Maybe one day I'll write that magnum opus. Most of my stuff I keep,
Yeah.
but it's very interesting thing in Deuteronomy, which I think Paul is operating out of. He says, so the Deuteronomy 4, be careful not to forget the covenant the Lord your God that he made with you. And after you have children and grandchildren and you've lived in the land, and then you will become corrupt. So it's like Moses here is just saying, this is what's going to happen to you guys. You're going to become corrupt. And you're going to worship idols and do evil in the eyes of the Lord and provoke him to anger. And you will perish quickly off the land. You will not live there for long. You certainly will be destroyed. This is before they've even entered into the land. It's like spelling out their, doom. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and only a few of you will survive among the nations to which the Lord will drive you. And there you will worship man-made gods of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or smell. But if from there, we have to ask what there is. The nations, while you're scattered among the nations, if from there, whatever nations that you're in,
Yeah.
if you're from there you seek the Lord your God, you will find him, and you will look for him with all of your heart. There's the heart, and with all of your soul. When you are in the tribulation, that's the Hebrew, when you're in the tribulation, and all these things happen to you in the last days. This is Deuteronomy 4:30. You will return
So there
to
you
the
go.
Lord your God, and you will obey him. And I thought, oh, God's still saving scattered Israel among the nations. He's saving them if in their heart they turn to the Lord, which is what Paul is calling the nations among whom they are scattered, that are also turning their hearts because of Israel's hardness in part, is riches for the nations. And I thought, that's Deuteronomy. And it says in the latter days. And I'm like,
It's almost
yeah,
like
we've been in the
Paul.
latter days for what, 1900 years? I'm like, so I find it extremely providential that today we're still talking about this. Now, I don't know about you, but when's the last time we've had hey, our next podcast is going to be whether or not the Hittites exist.
Yeah, no, seriously.
We don't
I mean,
have
nobody
that
talks.
conversation, but we're having this one. You can't get away from it. What's the
No.
DNC? The DNC talks about what? Israel. What's the RNC convention? What do they talk? Israel. Everyone's talking about Israel. That's not
Candace
an
Owens is
accident. That's
now.
not an accident at all.
Yeah.
Because you got to ask this question, Romans 2, who is Israel? And
Yeah.
obviously we're not in the age to come yet. That's obvious to any bonehead that cares to walk outside. We're not in the age to come. Oh, so those promises, you can still get in through covenant. How? Faith. Faith
Yep.
in Yeshua HaMashiach, Bani David, the son of David, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And I'm like, oh,
Otherwise, we
great,
should all just be.
good news.
Yeah, and I'm gonna close on this because we hit all the points. Otherwise, we should all just be hyper preterists. So, I'm glad we got to talk about this, and it is a problem, but it's a theological problem. It's a biblical problem, and the exegesis of Scripture must be the determining factor for this. And
Yeah,
we can see why people have a theological incentive to hold to anti-Semitism. Again, not a false anti-Semitism, but a
yeah,
true disdain and contempt. Because again, I'm not going to concede that word just because there's false words and usage doesn't mean there's not a true anti-Semitism. Just like heresy is overused, there's still a true heresy out there.
yeah.
And this is a true anti-Semitic eschatology. And sadly, have you come across this much? Because you're in the Presbyterian world and the Reform world. Have you come across this much in
Not
your dealings?
not in the everyday. Most of the church for popular dispensational premillennial reasons, fully support Israel. That's like a plank,
Yeah.
So, and that's why I make the distinction, critical of the state of Israel. Here's a fact: Israel's a state. That's whether you think that's
Whether you like it or
fulfilling
not.
prophecy or whether you don't. I don't think it's any particular fulfillment that they're being a state. My only thing is prophetically is that they're still here. What entity or form they take in terms of nation state or scattered among the nations, that's pointless. That's irregardless. The fact of the matter is we're still discussing and we're still saying this. And in the providence of God, they are a state. So it is what it is. They're a chartered member of the United Nations, as are we. So we're on equal sovereignty there as far as all of that concerned. That's a fact. Whether you like Israel or whether you don't like Israel doesn't make any difference. That's just a fact.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to dismantle that, which I don't see that happening anytime. That's not happening anytime soon, as far as I know. I'm thankful that Judaism, and all of the flavors is still here. That to me is very significant. So I do, when I find out somebody's Jewish, especially in scholars of this and the other, yeah, I want to get to know and start talking, and we're kinship there. There's especially Orthodox Jews who believe in the Tanakh, just like a fundamentalist would. They don't question whether or not Moses existed. That Moses existed. That's what it says. It's what it.
Yeah.
I don't care what the historiographers are saying. I don't care what your Cambridge University says. It says Moses wrote this. That's what he wrote. That's it. It's God's word. Period. Well, yeah, I can get along with that. That's great. That gets my foot in the door. And I'm thankful, that conversation, I think by providence, is still going on. I think the anti-Semitism and preterism, full preterism, is they've almost just completely they've totally wrote that off. So the statement that I mentioned in the beginning, where they were wiped off the face of the earth by the Romans, no, they weren't. Have you heard of the Talmud and the Mishnah? Well, how can they function without a temple? You might want to read Daniel, who never had a temple. He didn't have a temple. Where did Abraham never had a temple. Jacob never had a temple. Where's his temple at? You don't have to have a temple. Where does it say you got to have the temple is in heaven? There's one passage in Ezekiel that says, God, I will be your sanctuary. You can worship me with the fruit of your lips, and out of the abundance of your heart, you can worship and perform sacrifices and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, oh, so in other words, Judaism had without the temple or land or anything else, they could still survive in terms of the heart, spiritual worship. Yeah, and they went right into that. Just like Paul offers spiritual sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
That's where is he getting that from? He's a Jew.
Yeah, he's getting from Hebrew scriptures.
Where do you think he's getting it from? So what a richness that's giving. So it's if their hardness means richness, what does that mean? Richness for whose richness is this that Gentiles would be getting? Theirs, their richness. Well, what richness do they have? They have the oracles of God. They have the it's if Israel is still here, and they are, then the resurrection of the dead has not yet taken place.
Yes.
That's the best argument that I've got against all forms of preterism and full preterism. We
Amen.
shouldn't be talking about Israel at all today in the capacity that we're talking. They should be gone, out of here,
Yeah.
no more.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Amen. Well, Dr. Frost, thank you for joining us and talking about this. I appreciate your work. And to the audience, if you could please like and share this video, it helps get the truth of God's scriptures out. And they can follow you on Facebook, correct?
Yeah, just my Samuel Frost Facebook page, and then vigil.blog, vigil.blog. You can find a lot of my articles and stuff and books and things like that there too. So
Perfect.
I'd
All right.
like to do a podcast thing like this, but my time anymore, both working at the jail facility and then church stuff, and then I'm married, so my wife is. Hey, what about me?
Yeah, mine
Oh yeah,
too.
yeah. Hey, what about me? Because I study a
Yeah,
lot.
no,
I read. I read most of the time. When I have downtime, I just read. Um,
that's my life.
so I'd love to do a podcast kind of thing. Maybe I'll talk to you privately about. People have told me, "Hey, you need to start doing a podcast thing."
Well,
But
you're always on podcasts too. Like,
I'm always
I always
yeah,
see you floating around out
right.
there.
Yeah, someone's asking me. I got some with Donnie Budinsky that's coming up, and so yeah, and I appreciate very much you letting me take your time here.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right. Yeah. Thank you again to the viewers, and thank you, Dr. Frost. And tune in for next time. We'll see you around. Take care and God bless.